Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Daniel Darling, Director of the Land Center for Cultural Engagement at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary and a Fellow at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dan is also a pastor, a columnist for World, and a contributor to USA Today. He writes books, which is the occasion for our conversation today is actually this book, In Defense of Christian Patriotism, published by Broadside Books. Pastor Darling, thank you for being with us, and welcome to Acton Line.
Well, thank you for having me. Such an honor to be on here with you. And, I'm a huge fan of the work that you do at Acton, and just really important and timely work that I've benefited from and recommended to others.
Oh, thank you so much. When I was reading this book, I thought to myself, every 4th of July, I send my father a text. And it's a quote from Mark Twain, and it goes something like this. It goes, "We are called a nation of inventors, and we are. We could still claim that title and wear it as its loftiest honors if we had stopped with the very first thing we had ever invented, which is human liberty." And I was thinking, I'm not the median American. None of us are the median American. All of us come from different times, different places, different contexts. But I couldn't help thinking when I picked up your book, I'm like, who doesn't love baseball, hot dogs, apple pie, and Chevrolet? And this sort of, why is it that we need today a defense of patriotism?
Man, I'm glad you asked that question. I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. One, first of all, out of my own selfish love for the country. And, ever since my parents took a trip, we grew up in the Chicago area, and we loaded up our station wagon back in the early 90s or maybe late 80s. I think it was late 80s. This is before the internet. So somehow my mom planned a trip without the internet. And we drove to Washington, D.C., and I already had a little bit of interest in kind of history and politics, but man, I was just overwhelmed by seeing the monuments and seeing the Capitol and being at the Lincoln Memorial and just, the grandeur of it all. We're approaching our 250th birthday as a country. And every time I've visited some of the historical sites, or I've read a book about the founding or history, which I love. I'm a sort of amateur historian. I feel like reading all this stuff. I'm just struck by how really miraculous it is that not only did this revolution become something so magnificent in the United States, but that it's held for 250 years. I mean, it's a little rickety. We need some oil in a few places, but this experiment is held. So that was my first desire. The second is, I know this is not news to you, but I do think America is suffering from a crisis of ingratitude. I think we're suffering from a crisis of self-loathing. There's a deep cynicism and nihilism that is set in among Americans, that we have a hard time believing our own story. And we have a hard time being proud of this country. And I see most of that on the left, which is not surprising with, the sort of soft Marxist sort of, teaching of history, things like the 1619 Project, and even before that really told the story of America with America as the villain. But I also see it creeping in on the right, that, this is a failed experiment. Look at modernity. Look at all the sexual revolution. This has failed. Maybe this project wasn't good to begin with. And I really wanted to call Americans back to patriotism. I guess a third reason is, as an American Christian, quite often Christians are shamed for loving their country. That the idea of patriotic involved Christians is somehow a danger to the republic. Even a lot of pastors, well-meaning pastors, really sort of warn their flock to not, against patriotism for fear that it's idolatry, that it's. And so I wanted to help Christians think about what does it look like to be a citizen of the kingdom of God as we are, and a citizen of the country. Can we love God and love our country at the same time? And I believe we can.
Mm-hmm. And you make the case in the book, not just that we can, but that we should. That there's not, it's not even that there's something incompatible with patriotism in the Christian faith, but that there's something fundamentally compatible with these things, that these things go together in a very natural way. I think about this in terms of, we have different traditions within Christianity, and you see this in catechisms expressed in the fourth commandment, Catholic numbering. I think it might be fifth, the honor your mother and father,
right,
sort of thing. And historically, both among Catholics and among Protestants, they've talked about respect for authority, duly constituted authority, nations, affections for family. It's not just mom and dad. It's also leaders in the church, leaders in communities, and leaders of nations. This is how this has historically been interpreted. If you look at that, is that something that folks have lost touch with when they're viewing, when they're viewing this through a first commandment lens? When some pastors are looking maybe askance in America as a potential source of idolatry, instead of the traditional way of thinking about nations and rulers under the heading of that latter commandment.
That's a great way of putting it that I hadn't thought of, but you're exactly right. And you could fit loving and honoring the nation where God has put you under that sort of ordering. Where I get at it is a couple places. One, First Peter and Hebrews says that Christians are exiles, that we're strangers and foreigners. We live for another kingdom. And this is where a lot of pastors will say, well, see, we're citizens of the kingdom. Why bother with loving our country? Well, except when you go back to that exile language into the Old Testament in Jeremiah 29, which is where it originated, Jeremiah is talking to Jewish exiles in Babylon. They've lost their country, their home, their everything, and they're in this strange place where strange language, strange people, everything. And false prophets were telling them, hey, don't get too rooted here because you're going to be gone soon. And Jeremiah comes along and says, well, no, actually, you're going to be here a while. This is God's purpose for you. He has a plan for you here. And build homes and plant trees and get married and do all these things. And then he says, seek the welfare or the shalom or the flourishing of your city. And I think we can apply that today as Christian exiles of our nations, that to be an exile doesn't mean we pretend we're disembodied and don't have a place. We actually do. What does an exile do? We seek the welfare of our city. Well, how can we seek the welfare of our city and our nations, as we're commanded to do, if we're apathetic about it, or if we hate or loathe the country? So I really think it's incumbent on it. I also look at Paul. And Paul, was a proud Roman. He appealed his Roman citizenship. Now, his Roman citizenship wasn't more important to him than his heavenly citizenship, but he didn't abandon it altogether. And I think in Revelation, when all the nations are gathering around the throne, all the people are gathering around the throne of God, it says every nation, tribe, and tongue. People don't lose their ethnicity. They don't lose their nationality. It's part of the mosaic of God's of humanity that God has created. So all that to say, I think being rooted in a time and a place is important. Acts 17 says that God sovereignly puts people in borders for these places. So to me, this really matters that we love our country. It's about gratitude. It's about loving where God has put us with our symbols and our history and all those kinds of things. And then ultimately, we can talk about this if you want to press in a little bit. It's about ordering things rightly. We often present it as a binary. You either love God or love your country. You either love God or love this. That's not really what it's about. It's about putting these things in the right ordering.
Martin Luther, in his exposition of the first commandment, unpacks that, in the classic sort of what does this mean? The way he unpacks it is that we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. That doesn't mean that we should devalue and dismiss everything else. That means that God has a place of preeminence above these things. How does that, I think about growing up in scouting and, you have God, family, country. This was the formula, and often taught in that sort of order that there's an order in there of God first, family second, but country third, and all of them very important and things that we should organize our lives around. How do you see that fitting together? Because we live in a world of overlapping obligations, as you pointed out, and that can be confusing for folks, especially folks who feel like in order to be a serious Christian, they have to really, really prioritize their spirituality, their devotion, and sometimes folks get a little too on fire and they become a little myopic and they realize, God has a purpose in His creation as well, not just in the nations, but in the natural world, with other people, with neighbors. How do you? I mean, as both a pastor and sort of an academic, how do you unpack that for folks that are struggling with these tensions?
Well, it really is, as you said, it's about a hierarchy of loves. It's about ordering of loves, and you really, in the book, I try to dig into that and help Christians think through that. And I borrow a lot from C.S. Lewis, in his great book, The Four Loves, which I highly recommend folks read. He actually talks about patriotism in there and in Mere Christianity in a great way. A little bit from Chesterton too, but ultimately Augustine talked about ordering our loves, the ordo amortis, and I think that's rooted even in Scripture. You think about the passage in First Peter where he says, love. He says, respect all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Well, there's a sort of hierarchy there, right? We don't fear the king because the king, because we have a conscience, because we're children of God, we fear God, but then we honor the king, we love our brotherhood. So there's a hierarchy there that I think is really important. And we know how to do this, really, if you think about it. We know how to deal with lesser allegiances that are ordered in the right way. 23 years ago, I made a vow to my wife. You could say I pledged allegiance to my wife. The minister didn't say, well, Dan, you either have to choose between loving God and loving Angela. Well, no, he said, if you love God as your highest love, then from that will flow love for your wife and for your children. And I would say for your country. And in fact, we love these lesser things better when we don't make them God. And there is a way in which this can get out of order where you can put your country above everything. We see this with Jonah, right? That his love of country superseded his obedience to God and the mission of God. But it doesn't mean we choose either or, at least most of the time. Are there times we have to say no to our country? Yes. But, putting them in this right order really matters. If I love God as my highest love, I will love my wife in the appropriate way. If I love my wife as my highest love, then I will expect things from her to fulfill that only God can do. And same with my children. I hear people say, I'm going to make my children my everything. Well, if you do that, you're going to have expectations of them that they can't meet. You're going to look for things from your kids that only God can provide. It's the same thing for our country. The best kind of citizens, contrary to what you hear from the media and other places, the best kinds of citizens are citizens who first love God and then love their country. Because then we can have a realistic love for our country. We can see her flaws. We can have a measured love, a measured patriotism that understands this is not the kingdom of God. We're never going to have it perfect down here, but we can do some good. We can love where God has placed us. And I just think it's really important. And I also think that if you care about justice, if you care about writing, if you look around and see all the problems with the country and think, man, so many things. Well, repair only comes from love. And if you are apathetic or dismissive or even hate your country, that's really a poor motivation for social reform. All the great social reformers in our country, from Frederick Douglass to Martin Luther King to Lincoln to others, they grounded their activism in a love for the ideals of America that they felt we weren't fully living up to, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this sort of hatred or dismissal of America doesn't actually accomplish what people think it's accomplishing.
Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned there's a confusion of categories for folks. Mm-hmm. There's a failure to see these things in proper relation to each other. There's a sort of resentment and bitterness that animates some of this. Mm-hmm. But I wonder if, particularly when we're looking at the biblical tradition and we're looking at the tradition of the early church, mm-hmm. it's a very different world. In translating mm-hmm. those sort of concepts from the ancient world, from the medieval world, into sort of the modern conception of the nation state is difficult. Even when you look at the language of those catechisms, that it talks about honoring authorities more than nations or systems. It's because many of these creeds and catechisms are originally devised in a time in which we still very much have kings and queens, and those are the sorts of rulers we're looking to. We're not looking at this sort of constitutional republics like we have in America, and how does translating that, especially because so much of what we think about in the nation isn't only the governing authority, but it is that baseball, it's jazz, it's language, it's literature. Mm-hmm. There are all, it's a nation's geography, it's its natural mm-hmm. beauty. There are all sorts of things when we think about being Americans that are beyond just, that include our civic life, but they're beyond that. And how do we bring a biblical lens to those sorts of, to make that transition? Because the world is so different, but we know that the scriptures still do speak to us today.
That's a great question. I think when I think about patriotism or love of country, I'm thinking of love of the people, the place, the symbolism, the rich history, the culture, and the ideals. Now that can vary from place to place, mm-hmm. but I do think not all, I want to make the case, not all cultures are the same. So I don't want to flatten everything, but, because I've had people say, well, this is great. This works well for America. What do you tell a Christian in China who's, in jail or a house church and threatened persecution, or someone in North Korea? Well, patriotism and love for country doesn't necessarily, and frankly, quite often it doesn't translate into blind support for the current leadership and government. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt talked about this. He said sometimes patriotism requires you to oppose policies and oppose things. I think of someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who could have stayed in safety in the United States or UK. He went back to Germany to oppose the Nazi regime, in part because he loved Germany. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to restore Germany to its true purpose, not what had been hijacked. And so I think if you're someone in one of these countries where it's not a great situation, there are certain parts of the culture. I think of China, right? Mm-hmm. The totalitarian government, the Marxism and all that stuff is really wicked. But there are aspects of Chinese culture and heritage that are beautiful and wonderful that someone can love and appreciate, even as they oppose what's going on. And in America, patriotism doesn't mean that we endorse everything an administration does, or sometimes it means we oppose it. But we don't do it with the kind of cynicism that loathes the country. So I think it is portable from times and places in terms of whether you're living under a kingdom in the medieval era, or if you're living in democracy today or some other place. It's a love for the people and place where God has put us, Acts 17, a really desire to see as much as we can with what resources and agency we have to see that place improved, to reflect, more of what is right and fair and just.
Yeah, there's this is very good, and this helps bridge that gap. There's another sort of modern gap that I was thinking about as I was
Mhm.
reading the book, and one was, is there a difference between a sort of nationalism and patriotism? Because we have patriotism is something you can find analogs in the scriptures, in the prophets, of a call to love where you're placed by the Lord. But you also have sort of this 19th century phenomena of a very different conception of nation, that I think that at least Lord Acton suspected was less compatible with the Christian tradition, and often he thought it was opposed. He has a great essay called Nationality, in which he writes, beginning by a protest against the domination of race over race in the mildest and least developed forms, it grew into a condemnation of every state that included different races, and finally became a complete and consistent theory that the state and the nation must be coextensive. And this is the sort of story of German reunification, of Italian reunification, but it's also the story of the sort of nationalism that Bonhoeffer would fight in the National Socialism of his day, and he fought it. I think you correctly posit on the grounds of a patriotism, but those are very different things. How do you see the relationship between those?
That's a great question. I get asked that a lot, and it's a complicated answer. I think, first of all, we have to admit that today the term nationalism has been sort of used as a pejorative against what I would consider healthy patriotism or healthy, Christian engagement with our society. And it's been kind of made elastic to cover all these things. However, I do think there is a form of nationalism, and there's really two areas where I think it would separate from patriotism. One is the one you mentioned, where if by nationalism we say, I love my country, we have a distinction, we have certain things that are unique to our country, our place, our people, that's a healthy thing, right? That whether you're in the United States or you're in another country, that you feel toward your country, right? The Irish love Ireland and the Germans love Germany, all that kind of stuff. But there's an unhealthy kind of blood and soil nationalism that I think we should fight. I think it's a small cohort of people. I don't think it's the majority, but they're loud enough that I think it's an ongoing conversation. And it's particularly pernicious here in the United States because America is really unique. We are both a people, but we're also an idea. And, blood and soil nationalism, kinism, all that stuff is really, I think, antithetical to the Christian gospel. There is a unique American culture. I think we can be proud of that and expect folks who come here to assimilate to that. That's a reasonable expectation. But there's a kind of unhealthy kind of blood and soil nationalism I think we should reject. And like you said, this is what Bonhoeffer was fighting against. And I think we reject it not by being, one of the ways that we fight against that is with a healthy sense of patriotism and healthy sense of love of country. I don't think we fight it with the sort of bland secularism or the sort of indifference to the United States. The other part of true nationalism, I don't want to talk about the pejorative that's used for folks, but the true Christian nationalism, there's a handful of folks, whether it's Protestant Christian nationalists or Catholic integralists, who raise some good points about the need for a moral order in order for democracy to work. And yet many of them are dissatisfied with the constitutional order and they think it's failed, and they want to sort of start over, or they look longingly toward a sort of medieval theocracy type of thing, or toward magisterial Protestantism. And, the founders, they didn't want that. The founders understood, they had looked at the long view of church history and world history and saw that anytime you had a sort of state church, you sort of had the church and the state interlocked in an unhealthy way. It was bad for the state and for the church, right? For the church, it's bad because you don't know who the true converts are. It poisons the church. You see the history of the popes and all that kind of stuff, and the religious wars. They were scarred by the religious wars. The founders were, and it's bad for the state, right? A state that can tell people how to worship, where to worship, what to think, how to properly is really, that's not the role of the state. So they didn't want that, and yet they understood that for this experiment in government to work, it had to have uh, morality and virtue and religion, and I would argue a thick layer of Christianity underneath, right? John Adams said this will only work for religious and moral people. Even Thomas Jefferson, who was the most secular of our founders, and Franklin, who was a Unitarian, said that God governs in the affairs of men. You have to have this kind of this won't work. Liberty will become license, and so I don't think they ever envisioned secularism, where you're pushing Christianity out of the public square, you're pretending that there's no moral basis for these things. But they didn't want a state church. They didn't want theocracy. I think the founders came to the American experiment scarred by the religious wars, scarred by church-state things. We come at it 250 years later, a bit scarred by modernity, but I think we should arrive at the same place, that you don't want to empower the government to prey on people's consciences, to pave over the conscience, to force people to believe or not believe certain things. And yet you also have to acknowledge that underneath all this has got to be some moral order that, and many of our presidents communicated this, right? Eisenhower understood this, Harry Truman, others. So I think that's the kind of delicate balance that the founders struck that we need to maintain.
Yeah. So I think you're right that this Christian nationalism, this Catholic integralism is very marginal today. This is a predominantly fringe movement wherever you find it. Is much louder online than it is on the ground in any churches and any local communities. But it's still there. I've run into these folks, and at least in the tradition of the Catholic Church, it's not too long ago that these sorts of illiberal forces held sway through much of Europe and through much of Latin America.
Right.
And you had these clerical fascist regimes in Portugal, in Spain, in Croatia, in Slovakia. Italy is more complicated in all sorts of ways, but in Vichy France, in fact, you had much of the church hierarchy were enthusiastic supporters of that regime, and there's a terrible legacy there. You have countries, like France, like Spain, that are extremely secular these days, and I think part of that is the legacy of this sort of poisoned fruit of this sort of integralism that you had in different parts of Europe. This reminds me, Adam Smith and David Hume both supported church establishment, or both Hume supported church establishment and Smith opposed it on the same grounds, which is that state churches tend to actually increase disbelief in a population, and Hume, as an atheist, wanted more of that, and Smith was less sanguine about that. And when you have these movements, it's made me in more recent years, as this has gotten more prominent, and again, still fringe, but more prominent, it's made me more sympathetic with the secularists than I might have been 10, 15 years ago. Is that, while this isn't by any means the majority of Christians that are interested in that sort of program, there are some highly vocal, highly visible people who emphatically are. What would you say to unbelievers, to folks who come from non-Christian religious traditions that see this and it's frightening to them? And when they see people calling for a Christian patriotism, even if they try to make the sort of distinctions that I think you make and that you helpfully make, it makes them uneasy.
Yeah, I understand that. I think there's kind of a gumbo here of a lot of things swirling in the present moment, a kind of perfect storm that have people nervous about different things from different ends. On the one hand, I'm not at all sympathetic to ideas of Catholic integralism or magisterial Protestantism or theocracy or theonomy, nor do I think is a majority of Americans. So let's understand that, it's, besides being an unworkable, I think, arrangement, and I would argue something that is not prudential in a fallen world, I also don't think a majority of Americans are going to select that, right? I mean, we can hardly pass a pro-life referendum in a red state. But so I'm not sympathetic to that government arrangement. However, I think part of the reason some people have gotten there, it's an overreaction to, I think, this radical secularism that has pushed Christianity out of the public square. Even in our jurisprudence for the last part of the 20th century, it was like sort of any incidental contact between the government and the church was considered problematic. So the Establishment Clause was sort of used to punish Christianity, punish religion. And I think, thankfully, a lot of that's been pulled back with this court in the last 25 years, the Supreme Court, getting rid of the Lemon Test and all those kinds of things. But I think people see the fruit of modernity, the fruit of secularism, expressive individualism, and they're saying, well, this is not healthy either. Look what we have. We have the redefinition of the family and marriage. We have, loneliness and individualism and all this kind of stuff. This is not healthy for society. And so they go too far. They reject that rightly, but then they go too far to say, well, the solution is, an explicitly Christian state or something like that, which I think is the wrong solution. But I do think we have to acknowledge, on the one hand, that this experiment of ordered liberty was never meant to be expressive individualism and all this kind of stuff, right? There has to be a moral basis underneath it. At the same time, I think other people are rightly nervous, as you said, because they hear people saying and making outlandish claims and desires of the kind of a theocratic state and all these kinds of things. Some of the worst and most shrill voices have delved into things like, kinism and racial superiority, all that kind of stuff. So on the one hand, you have folks who are embracing the sort of Catholic integralism or Protestant Christian nationalism, the true version, not the pejorative, because they're rightly looking at the fruits of modernity and all these kinds of things, expressive individualism, the sexual revolution. They're saying this can't hold. But then on the other hand, you have people looking at folks like the nationalists and integrals and saying, well, that looks scary. Do they even believe in democracy? I also think we've been trained to think in the last several decades to think of Christianity as somehow dangerous for democracy. And this has sort of been a canard really going back to the mid-70s. Evangelicals, they're problematic, conservative Catholics, they're a danger to democracy. And I want to say, actually, Christianity, a healthy Christianity is a boon to democracy. I think it helps democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville noticed this, right? When he came, he talked about the two spirits, the spirit of religion, the spirit of liberty in America, how those two things were running parallel in this kind of tension. And I think when you take Christianity, or when a church attendance drops, when all these things kind of fade, what replaces, we have this fiction. Richard John Neuhaus talked about this in The Naked Public Square 40 years ago. And he said, the naked public square won't be naked very long because something will fill it. So if you pull Christianity out, what fills it is not better. When you pull virtue and religion out, it's not better. And the founders understood this. So I would say, on the one hand, to the secularists who are nervous, I would say, if you want to preserve democracy, even if you aren't Christian, you should root for a healthy church-going Christianity in America. I'm even hearing a lot of skeptics and atheists say this, right? There was this great piece in the Atlantic a couple of years ago by Derek Thompson, who said, look, I used to cheer for the fact that church attendance was going down in America because I'm like, oh, we're becoming more pluralistic. This is great. He said, I actually don't think that anymore. He said there's something about church going that bound people together, this sort of civil religion that was good for the country. Even Richard Dawkins recently said that all things being equal, he'd like to live in a Christian country, right? Even though he's an avowed atheist. So there's something there, the sort of moral order. But I would also say to those who long for, a theocratic state, I think that's the answer to secularism. One of the axioms of Christian theology is man's depravity. And one of the things the founders understood was if you center power in one entity, it can be corrupt. And if you give the state too much power, it can be corrupt. And I don't think it's good to give the state the power to regulate and think religious matters, to regulate worship. It'll actually get worse. It'll corrupt religion and it'll be bad for the state. So I think the arrangement we have that we need to preserve is the best one in a fallen world. I think I answered your question.
No, that's great. And I think, and this gets to, there's something about America that's sort of the secret sauce in this, that the combination of a moral and religious people, the sort of Protestant Christian sort of formation, and especially relevant is the role of dissenters in that, of Baptists, of Congregationalists, of folks who have always had a keen appreciation of religious freedom when magisterial Protestants have not. This is a blind spot that Lord Acton would point out in his own writings. He had this appreciation for the English sort of dissenter tradition. But you've also got, it strikes me as that America has had, while Christianity has had a leavening effect on America, most certainly, and this is widely acknowledged among religious folks, America itself has had, I think, a leavening effect on Christianity. Particularly, from where I'm coming from a perspective of Catholicism, people like John Courtney Murray, theologians who have reflected deeply on America and said, you know what, there's truths about the human person that are outlined very explicitly in the American experiment that have been less clear in the history of the church at certain times, at certain places. And the church needs to be forthright in affirming things like the dignity of the human person, religious liberty, all of these things that the Catholic Church has a historically mixed record on, but that he looked back into the tradition of the church, the scriptures, and saw that, this is all there, and we need to bring this more and more to the front. And the Second Vatican Council did a lot of that.
Yes.
And folks like John Courtney Murray were vindicated as theologians.
Yes.
Do you think that America can have that sort of leavening capacity, maybe with our non-Christian communities? I think about, we have examples in India of Hindu nationalism that are very pernicious. We have, in the Islamic world, we have Islamism that is disastrous and in many cases horrific. But you also have these communities in America, and my hope and my prayer for those communities is that America itself can sort of be a leaven there to help in the ways that many Christian traditions have been enriched by the witness that the American experiment has provided in history, that these communities could then, as part of that experiment, as participants in that, bring those lessons, integrate them within their own religious traditions. What do you make of that?
That's such a great point, and I've been observing and talking about that lately. Yes, on the one hand, Christianity, I think, is essential to democracy. If you think about the idea of human rights, the idea of the dignity of all people, that's borrowed from Christianity. I mean, the founders talked about our rights coming from God, which, by the way, was a really revolutionary statement in world history, to say your rights don't come from the king, your rights don't come from the state, your rights come from God. But as you said, I think as the American experiment unfolded, this new idea that was never before tried in the world, if you think about it, I think it did have a leavening effect on religion, in some good ways. You know, you pointed out the Second Vatican Council. You know, less than 50, 60 years earlier, there were popes that were mocking the idea of religious liberty. And then all of a sudden you have John Courtney Murray, but then you have the Second Vatican Council with
Dignitatis Humanae.
Yeah, Dignitatis Humanae. I was trying to remember that, which is a beautiful, incredible document on religious liberty, which doesn't say that, oh, Catholics have suddenly changed their mind, we believe in this, but they're saying, actually, we have resources in our own tradition, in the Catholic tradition, to support this. But I think part of that was to the observation of, okay, this is actually working. Catholics are flourishing in America under this system. We don't have to marry church and state for Catholicism to flourish. I think other religions have done that too. Now I would argue, for the sake of argumentation, as a Protestant and as a Baptist Protestant, that this is the argument that Baptists make, that Protestant was about reform in the church, which I think Protestantism reform not just just became its own sort of tradition, but it also initiated reform among the Catholic Church. But then Baptists feel that we sort of continued the Reformation, right? So there was Reformation in doctrine and retrieval. This is according to the Protestant view. Don't want to offend my Catholic brothers and sisters, but there's this retrieval and Reformation. But then Baptists took it further when it came to the role of the magistrate, church and state, and all that kind of thing. So I do think, in many ways, we owe those early Baptist agitators for insisting on rights of conscience. But as you said, religions came here and experienced America and adjusted. As you mentioned, the Catholic Church with Vatican II became then a champion for religious liberty, but other religions have too. The
Presbyterians revised their confession in 1789.
That's right. The Presbyterians revised their confession, and Kevin DeYoung, who's a brilliant thinker, has done a whole thing on that, which is really good. Why they revised their confession? Well, they're observing the same things. The Church of Latter-day Saints adjusted, with polygamy, with race and those issues. I think, one of the challenges is, a lot of people have concerns about Islam in America. And, everywhere you see Islamic states, you don't see the freedom and the sort of human rights that you see in the Christian West. And they're nervous about it taking over. So Islam, when it comes to America, has to assimilate. I think you could see a similar move. That's the debate. Can Islam adjust to this and have a place for religious freedom and all those kinds of things? I think so. I've talked to some American Muslims that really believe in this stuff. But you're right. The American experience has had a leavening effect on religion. Not all of that has been good, right? This sort of individualized, privatized religion has been bad, but it's been good in the sense of human rights and human dignity, which, by the way, go back to Christianity itself. So in some sense, the way that the church is often judged is by its own standards that it introduced into the world. So that's a very good observation, very good question.
Yeah. On there's a book forthcoming from a longtime friend of the Acton Institute, Mustafa Akul, called "No Compulsion in Religion," and it's a collection of essays by a bunch of Islamic scholars struggling with this, and how can they affirm religious freedom in an Islamic world that in most places in the Islamic world is very hostile to this idea.
Right.
But there are Muslims that have seen the American experiment, have seen the witness of Christianity, and they're grappling with this and trying to move the Islamic world forward on these issues of human dignity and religious freedom. One of the things you talk about towards the end of the book, you start talking about, okay, what is this? If we see this renewal, this reinvigorated Christian patriotism, that's a properly ordered patriotism, not a sort of blood and soil nationalism, but is animated by love and by and animated by service to God and neighbor. What does that do for a whole host of things? And you focus particularly on family and education, you view as sort of very fertile ground for this sort of renewal. What do you see that sort of healthy Christian patriotism could do towards the renewal of family in our educational institutions in the United States?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I didn't just want to write a book to say, hey, it's good and proper to be patriotic. It's good and proper to be involved politically. Here's how to think well about our history. I wanted to do all that, but then I was, okay, now that you feel this way, how do we renew the country we love? How do we roll up our sleeves and ensure that the next 250 years are even more better, more flourishing, and more aligned with our ideals than the past 250 years? How do we ensure that the country that our children and grandchildren inherit will be as good as the one we had? And if you're a true patriot, that's really what you care about. You want to make sure that this thing endures beyond your lifetime. Well, I think some of the key areas, as I mentioned, I first talked about the church. As a Christian, I'm biased toward the church, and I think healthy churches are essential for our communities. And there's a lot we can do in the public square. I'm active on legislation and policy. I think it's vitally important Christians should be involved, but there's a limit to what politics can do and legislation can do. But the church has the message that really can change the human heart. And this is ultimately the renewal of America is going to have to be a spiritual renewal. If you look at the country, we've had a few times of that: the Great Awakening, post-World War II, those kinds of things. I think we're going to need something like that, a spiritual renewal in the country. And so I think the church has to be at the center of that. And then I talk about the family. And I think if you think about all the major social ills that we think about, whether it's economic inequality and poverty, whether you think it's the crisis of manhood, think about crime, all these kinds of things, most of them are downstream from the breakdown of the family. And it's not just me as a Christian saying that because I believe it, but you look at all the social science data. People like Brad Wilcox and others, even folks who are not necessarily conservative, have said, look, you can't escape what the data says, that children that grow up in a home with a mother and a father, the outcomes are much better. They're way less likely to end up in poverty, way less likely to end up in prison. They're more likely to get married and stay married, all these kinds of things. And so I think we have to really focus on the family with our policy, whether there's ways to economically stabilize families, to champion families. I would love for the conservative movement, and frankly, we often vote Republican. That's where conservatives are welcome, to champion family, the family, not in a harsh way, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that says we believe this is the building block of society. This is important. We want to stabilize healthy families. I think as the families go, so goes the nation. And then I think education matters. George Washington, in his first inaugural, mentioned education. He talked about how education is an educated citizenry is so important. And in his last inaugural address, he did too. He actually wanted to establish a national university. He never was able to do that. But I think most people agree that we've got some real issues with our educational system, whether it's K-12 or higher ed. And part of it is, a lot of the sort of Marxist social justice teaching that's infiltrated this kind of Howard Zinn view of history, all these kinds of things that have infiltrated. And I think this is a real issue that Christians, I think, should pour their lives into, whether it's into making our public schools better or initiating reforms like we're seeing with this kind of school choice renaissance. All those things are really good. I'm actually seeing hopeful signs too. I love what I'm seeing with the sort of school choice revolution going on around the country. Some of the reforms that even liberals and conservatives are agreeing on in our public schools. I think our public schools still matter, but we need to improve them. And I'm seeing, after long last, some real movement in higher education. Now I'm biased to Christian higher education because I teach here, and I think what our evangelical and Catholic Christian institutions of Christian higher ed are doing is really recovering the classic purpose of education. But I'm also seeing in some of our state schools. I mean, University of Texas has really added, they have a new provost that has got a really good view and purpose for education. And some of our other institutions are starting to do that too. So I don't think it's hopeless. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think it's really essential for renewal of our country.
Yeah. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in education. Mississippi did some reading instruction reforms that have bared tremendous fruit, and that are being adopted by other states now.
That's right. Yeah.
Leading trends. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading this book, and you mentioned some names earlier. You mentioned Frederick Douglass, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln as some sort of historical modes for inspiration for this sort of Christian patriotism. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was another one that you mentioned. Is there anybody more contemporary today, who's with us today, who's working today, that you think is a real good model of somebody leading with a very positive sense of Christian patriotism, who's really making a difference today, or trying to make a difference, putting up a fight at least, and doing it in a way that that is both authentically American and that is animated by deep Christian principles?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. What I think is, when I think nationally, I'm like, it's easy to get discouraged if you're following the up and downs of the news cycle, what people on Twitter are arguing about, all that kind of stuff. When I look locally, I see a lot of patriots, a lot of people rolling up their sleeves in their communities, trying to do good work, churches that are, tutoring children in schools and feeding the poor, working together to, help alleviate addictions and provide, strength in communities. And I see people giving up their time and their energy to help, build communities. I talk in the last part of the book about localism. I do think the big national issues matter, but I do think, if we're following Chesterton's essay about patriotism, where he talks about patriotism as a way to love, you start loving the thing that's closest to you and you work your way out, essentially. Well, I think patriotism starts locally. Let me love my community. Let me invest in my local school or my community here. And I think there's a lot of folks rolling up their sleeves and doing some really good work. People starting, tutoring programs for children, people, adopting children, foster care, all that kind of stuff. I think that's where it begins, and sort of building these civic institutions. I'm encouraged by that. I really am. I know there's been a lot of disruption in the last decade or so, but I see folks doing that in a way that's really, really patriotic. And they're doing it because they love their country. They see the problems. They want to roll up their sleeves and do what they can. I think Christianity gives us a sense of realism, which is really important, that if you're a church-going Christian, faithful evangelical church-going Christian or Catholic church-going Catholic, you're going to church every week confronted by the transcendent and confronted by your own humility, your own mortality. You're worshiping God, not yourself. And that has a humbling effect that makes you realistic about, then when you go into the world, you realize, I'm not God. This is not the kingdom of God, but I can do a lot of really good work. I think people who make politics their God, that's where you get the sort of disappointment, the extremism, the sort of messianic fervor of, I've got to change the nation. This next election is everything. We're going to lose everything if we don't get this. Democracy is, dying because of this or that. When politics becomes existential, I think that's where it becomes extreme. But when you have folks who are confronted with the transcendent, they have a sense of realism. Like, okay, we can do a lot of good, but we can't do everything.
So my polling place here in Grand Rapids is a Lutheran church and in my neighborhood. And I go in and there's a big banner that I love right above the sanctuary that says, God's work, our hands. And I think that is exactly what you've described. And I think you're right to, Mr. Rogers used to say, look for the helpers. And what you've described is look around in your own community for that inspiration, those folks that are already doing it there. God is at work through them and through their faithful presence as Americans, as exiles, as both. Pastor Darling, thank you so much for a wonderful, thought-provoking book. This is In Defense of Christian Patriotism from Broadside Books. We'll include a link to this in the show notes. And thank you so much for being with us on Acton Live.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for just a really stimulating conversation, and really enjoyed it. Again, I'm a huge fan of all the great work that Acton is doing. I want to encourage folks to check out all of your great resources.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.